Welcome, everybody, to the October edition of the Fireside Chat. I hope everybody is doing well and is safe and healthy. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Brother Jason A. Mitchell be our guest speaker. Jason is a past master of Wasatch. Yeah, Lodge number 1, and is been very active in Masonry. He's been a past excellent high priest and illustrious master and eminent commander. He has received the Knight of the York Grand Cross of Honor and Knight Commander of the Red Branch of Erie. And he's currently serving as the Chief Adept of Utah College of the Rosicrucians. And Jason, I will turn it over to you for your talk tonight. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, happy to. Hopefully the audio is coming through. This is a new microphone, so I've never played with it before.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay. So this talk I kind of like to wrap up as which right is right. And it was born out of hearing probably for the 100th time or more the question from a brother saying, well, which rite should I join? Scottish Rite or York Rite? And I'm fairly certain we've all heard this before. And of course, there's a new increasing variation on that. Should I join no rite at all and just stay Blue Lodge? And I've quietly listened to the answers that brothers have received. And they're almost always couched as the correct answer and of varying quality. It ranges everywhere from personal opinion or personal experience, that is to say, it worked for me, therefore it works for you, all the way up to the most sincere attestations of dubious facts that you will find short of the History Channel. And oftentimes, because the asker is a younger brother and the answer is coming from someone who's older, there's an innate sort of, I will just take what you say as fact. There's no challenge, there's no critical thinking. Not that they would have the details to actually question what they're hearing. And it's disturbing in that regard because it's kind of a problematic question. And by that, I mean, when you ask the question, which rite should I join? Well, the York Rite isn't a rite per se, it's more than that. And it kind of furthers competition over collaboration. So let's get into that first part. The York Rite isn't a rite. By that, I mean the York Rite itself as a whole is not a progressively unfolding experience of Masonic initiation. I tend to look at the York Rite more as a greatest hits collection of Masonic degrees that were worked by itinerant Masonic lecturers. It's a catalog of Masonic experiences, to put it shortly. And some of those have coalesced into bodies, that is to say, chapter, council, commandery. Still, how we get those stories from body to body, and even within a singular body, are not necessarily progressive or sequential. They don't unfold in a linear pattern. And while, yes, KT has historically enjoyed a somewhat dominant position, and yes, the idea that the York Rite is a single entity extends all the way back to our current general bodies, operationally speaking, the lived-in experience of brothers is that the York Rite is a rite of rights, a confederation of degree system. And you don't have to take my words for it. If you go back to your lodges and go into the back room and move all the boxes and then move the other boxes and then go through the other boxes, you'll find the thousands of unhanded out York Rite pamphlets that describe the York Rite just as that, a confederation of degrees. And I want to be clear here. I'm not trying to say that that's a problem. Being a confederation of degrees is a perfectly valid Masonic experience. In point of fact, Eddie and Morin, when he assembled the Royal Secret, Order of the Royal Secret, he didn't create a rite. His was literally a greatest hits collection of all the popular degrees in the Bordeaux region of France. And there's questions on how much authority he did or didn't have to do that. But he was very clear in setting out that that's all he was doing. He was just collecting the quote unquote most popular or most important degrees wrapping them up in a story that didn't really interconnect them at all. In fact, even when the Supreme Council came out for the Scottish Rite in 1802, Micho, Delco Company, et cetera, they didn't even fix that. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Pike came along and actually turned it into a singular coherent system of degrees with an unfolding narrative that progressively told a story. This is part of the reason why we have AMD in the York Rite. Even though most of those degrees kind of come from Ecosse and continental origins, the York Rite is a confederation of degree systems. It's a home to everyone. It's not a monolith. And by considering the York Rite as a rite, you're doing a disservice. You are missing the power of having all of these degrees and reducing it to just 3 bodies. The second reason this question is problematic requires we do a little bit of history. By the early 90s, Grand Lodges could no longer ignore the fact that the Masonic population wasn't renewing itself. As much as we didn't want to admit it, our financial advisors didn't give us any other choice. We weren't replacing ourselves, and the DMLA weren't going to save us. And though the 90s was an economic boom, by and large, men joining Masonry weren't employed in the professions enjoying that boom, or if they were, these were professions that eroded work-life distinctions. And so there was no real way for them to have extracurricular activities because work was everything. And these factors meant every new man, every new dollar, every new minute were limited resources, and multiple organizations were all trying to grab them because the choice was get new blood or die trying. And for better or worse, and I posit it was unknowingly, York Rite and Scottish Rite and Shrine and other bodies began competing aggressively. The York Rite had an advantage because at the local level, it had relationships, and all Masonry is local. The Scottish Rite's advantages and the Shrine's advantages were at a national level. It had a unified and consistent message. The Scottish Rite even having the social cachet of the 33rd degree and all the public mystery that comes with that, and the Shrine with the hospitals, and they both had the they had the monetary resources to reach into every city in every state. The outcome of this is that it turned the Blue Lodge into a no man's land. Between the trenches of these organizations, all fighting over the Blue Lodge, they were in fact kind of just tearing it apart. And lodges splintered, and some lodges would go so far as to just straight up die over the perceived allegiance to the York Rite or the Scottish Rite, etc. There are well-documented instances of a single-family patriarch making a choice and then multiple generations just doing what dad did, doing what grandpa did, doing what Uncle Bob did, etc. And then for us as the York Rite, because we are not a single rite, this became even more problematic because at the national scale, the regional scale, the state scale, and the local scale, all of that competition still applied. And as men began commuting longer and longer distances to work, now different York Rite bodies within within neighboring towns were competing over those same men. And it just kept tearing itself apart further and further. And this is kind of how it existed up until early 90s. And then things began to change. And this is where it went from bad to kind of worse for us as York Rite Masons. As the leaders began watching the lodges die and historical buildings and resources being sold, started counting the entire Vietnam generation as a lost generation, there was a shift in the groupthink of Masonry. Local bodies began to rely heavily on grand bodies to survive. Grand bodies in turn started relying on department and national bodies to survive. Knowingly or unknowingly, we started to become a monolith. Power was condensed to a limited pool of people. Arguably speaking, one could make this case that the leadership of the York Rite of Freemasonry became the same 50 guys to go to Masonic Week every week. They just took their turns through the chairs. And in doing so, a new idea began to take hold. And that was the idea of the York Rite as a single rite. When I was coming up through the ranks here out in the West, I came across boxes and boxes of correspondence. And I have to imagine that, like most, my experience as being a secretary of Masonic bodies is no different than anyone else's. We are horrible at keeping track of information. We're great at holding on to the stuff we don't need, horrible at holding on to the stuff we do. But by and large, we end up keeping a lot of things that aren't necessary. But I went through it all and started reading it. And you begin to see the through line of starting right around 89, 88, all the way up through the mid 90s, this idea of almost starting off with a distaste. There was a letter from my Grand Commander to the Grand Encampment. And I keep this quote. There is no reason for the York Rite to diminish our importance or to continue to demean ourselves, in reference to looking at the York Rite as a confederation. And he wasn't alone. This wasn't like an one-off idea. This was part of the national dialogue that was occurring. And that shift began to occur. Our documentation, our published pamphlets started referring to York Rite as a single degree. In fact, we started just being bold about it. We came out and flat out said it is the system of Masonry every good Christian Mason should belong to. Just doubling down on the KT relationship and putting everything as subservient to KT. It's almost like, the Roman Republic becoming an empire. It's a massive change, but you don't really understand it when it's going on. You only get it through the benefit of hindsight. In fact, a number of years ago, not that long ago, but probably around 2006, 2007, the General Grand Council sold books claiming to be translated from the original handwritten copies of de Saguier himself. And part of the sales pitch was that it demonstrated that the York Rite has preserved the true and original Masonry. It's interesting because the book isn't in any way, shape, or form based on 18th century Masonic ritual. It's not even the 18th century use of the English language. If you get into, if the books are still out there and you can tear into it, right? Right at the front, the claim that it was translated from de Saguier. You don't need to translate 18th century English to be understood. We read 16th century English just fine, like the King James Bible or Shakespeare. Even a middle schooler can muddle through Middle English like the Canterbury Tales. It's only until you get to Old English like Beowulf that it's just, sounds like you've got a bunch of golf balls in your mouth and you don't know what's going on. So right at the face of it, the preface that it had to be translated is suspicious. And the whole story just begins to fall apart. The newspaper name is incorrect. The Grand Lodge and the library where all this information was housed is undocumented. It ignores the fact that there was no commercially available scanning technology to non-destructively deal with ancient documents and old documents that would have been available to Masonic libraries. This would have been high-tech Stanford University level stuff. It wasn't commercially available. The book presents the Solomon and the Ironworker. That's an 1864 story written by Charles Leland, but this paper comes out and claims it was invented in the 1700s by de Saguier. Kind of for me, the icing on the cake. If you just took any of the pieces of the work and did a quick Google search for them, even in 2006, 2007, the first result that came back was the original document. It was written in 1994 by William Brown, called A History of Freemasonry and the Development of the 15 Original Lectures. And it just presented them verbatim to include the lack of any citation, any critical research, or any peer review. It was a 20th century work that justified a desire within York Masonry to be a single rite. It was a sign of its time. And I don't throw anyone under the bus for that. All things being equal, had we been in that time, in that place, we would have also been part of the same dialogue, having the same conversation, believing the same thing. it certainly makes for a great bedtime story, especially if we're watching our beloved organizations die, but it has no basis in fact. So all of this is well and good. I think we can all agree there's problems in asking the question and framing it the way it is, Scottish Rite versus York Rite. And I don't want to dwell on the bad thing. I can tear apart the Scottish Rite just as readily as I can tear apart the York Rite. And the Shrine and the youth groups have all made their mistakes. Anyone that exists at our timescales has a checkered past. No one's perfect. And if we want to get into it, yes, Masons have a long history of telling ourselves bedtime stories. I mean, the Heramic legend at the end of the day is essentially biblical fan fiction. We don't treat it as a historical fact. And we do tolerate questioning it. We know it's not true. We don't base the power and value of Masonry off its historical accuracy. But this was a big shift for the York Rite in thinking, adopting this narrative that we're a single rite and KT sits at the top of it, and we're now directly competing for limited resources, and we're going to draw battle lines. It was unhealthy then, and with the benefit of hindsight, I think we can understand that it really didn't help. We're not talking today about how the York Rite and Scottish Rite, that competition saved everything. That it didn't. But the problems still exist, though. A new Mason doesn't know what to do. They don't know how to forge their own path. So it becomes beneficial to us to throw that question away and ask, what is a better question? What is a better way we can help brothers understand what they need to understand to carve their own path in Masonry? And I argue that if we don't do that, we're going to end up doing the one thing that no one wants to do. None of us wants to be the head of a body and at the end of the night, put the chairs on the table, turn off the lights, and lock the doors forever. But competition isn't going to avoid that outcome. That's why lodges were closing. That's why we are where we're at. So instead of looking at rites of Masonry and creating this competition and perpetuating unnecessary stories, I argue we should look at currents of Masonry. You can call them schools, I call them currents. And I argue that the Scottish Rite and York Rite are predominantly composed of two currents of Masonic experience, the craft current and the Hotz grade current. And to illustrate this, and by no means this isn't exhaustive, but to illustrate how I break down those currents. The craft current, I would argue, is entered apprentice, fellow craft, master mason, mark master, royal arch, all of Noahide Masonry that's in AMD to include Royal Ark of Dove, Royal Ark, Ark and Dove, Commander Noah. To a lesser extent, past master and most excellent. Personally, I never really saw those as degrees and more as just easy legal workarounds for an unnecessary problem. We really don't care if you're a past master or not. The Royal Arch still means what it means. The Hotz grade current would be everything in the Scottish Rite with the exception of the 13th degree, and would include Royal and Select Master, Super Excellent Master, and here's the part where I inevitably start offending people, all of the orders of the Commandery. While many of the ineffable degrees of the Scottish Rite do contain elements of the craft current, they contain what Mackey considers the distinguishing mark of Ecosse Masonry, what makes it unique against the backdrop of all other Masonry, which is an emphasis on the preservation of the Master's word. And that through line, that the Master's word is preserved, dominates the first 14 degrees of the Scottish Rite. So for a practical application, you can say anything that derived from the Scots master degree or came down through our lineages through Ramsey and everything that he sold, put it that way. The point being, when you're looking at this from the framework of currents, you don't care what rite they're in, Scottish Rite or York Rite. You help them make a decision without tribalism, without loyalties. If they want an experience that's going to be heavier on the craft side of things, then you can guide them that way. If they want something that's more Hotz grade, then you can guide them that way. It doesn't matter where they're going to get that experience from. And they can do that without feeling like they've made a choice that closes one door. They can do it without having to feel guilty. They can do what I think probably is the best way to maximize your Masonic experience. Join both. Both of these are American Masonry written large. If we want to talk about the American Masonic experience versus the English Masonic experience versus the Norwegian Masonic experience, what have you, it should be the totality of both these rites. They both emerged from some of our greatest thinkers. And to pick one or the other, it sets yourself up to only hear half the story. Even if there's telling the same overall story, it's how you tell the story. A great example of how you tell the story and why people were watching would have been Mad Men, TV show from about 10 years ago. People knew exactly what was going to happen, but it was how it happened that they turned in. That's why they watched it every week after week. And that's why we should that's why we should get rid of this idea of when someone says, hey, which should I join? York Rite, Scottish Rite. Sit down with them, have a conversation, find out where they want to go in Masonry. Ask what they know, what they don't know. Give them directions around what experience they want, not what brand of t-shirt they want to be wearing. And on top of that, I think that this idea of using currents of Masonry as a framework by which to formulate our Masonic experiences is even beneficial for us old cantankerous Masons. We can appreciate through currents how Masonry evolved, the depth to which these degrees have been expressed, and maybe, just maybe, we might even arrive at a better understanding of those degrees ourselves. But whatever you do, stop the tribalism. It's not going to help us. It's not going to help. It's not going to help our new Masons, and it's only going to further this divide to the point where one side's going to win. But that means the other side went home one day, put the chairs on the tables, turned off the lights and closed the door, and never came back. And that's a shame for all of us.
Thank you, Jason. That was an excellent presentation.